One of the co-conspirators in the case involving former Fall River Mayor Jasiel Correia was before Judge Douglas Woodlock yesterday for his sentencing. Antonio Costa pled guilty back in 2019. He also agreed to testify in Correia's trial, and you may remember that. And we're going to talk a little bit about his sentencing today. I'm pleased to be joined by Attorney Steven Sabra. Attorney Sabra joined us during our coverage of the trial of former Mayor Correia. Attorney Sabra, thank you for joining me. How are you?
Sure, I'm fine. Good to be with you.
As we record this yesterday, Judge Douglas Woodlock issued his sentence in the guilty plea of Antonio Costa. And he by and large, followed the recommendations of the prosecution and the defense in that Mr. Costa is not getting any jail time. He was sentenced to 3 years probation. The first 15 months of those will be under home confinement. He's also charged with 300 hours of community service and also a fine of $10,000 and a forfeiture of $107,550. Before we get into the details, Steve, what is your general reaction to the sentencing yesterday?
Well, my general reaction is that he meaning Tony Costa, got the benefit of early on cooperating with the prosecution, because considering what he pleaded guilty to, the fact that he got probation is significant. And in the U.S. Attorney's Office, the prosecutors talked about that when they made their presentation at the sentencing hearing yesterday, in the sense that they emphasized that really the only reason that Mr. Costa got probation was because he was the linchpin to the whole case involving at least the marijuana and the public corruption charges that were brought against Jasiel Correia. And essentially, the prosecutor's position was, without his cooperation, there really wouldn't have been a case. And his cooperation brought in all these other witnesses, or at least brought the U.S. Attorney's Office in contact with these other witnesses that also testified against Jasiel Correia at his trial.
Yeah. Now, in terms of, Judge Woodlock stated during his sentencing yesterday that, and I do have a couple of quotes here that I wrote down, that, the crimes that Mr. Costa had faced was, exceptionally serious crimes. And normally, he would have considered some sort of jail time. And this is something that is out of his norm, if you will, in terms of sentencing in this case. But he did mention that, his support of Mr. Costa's support in the trial, testifying, played a role. And also, what played a role was he does have some family commitments, even though the judge said that is not necessarily an overriding circumstance here, but he is caring for a mother and I believe a sister that he lives with. And that was a consideration. But let me just ask you a little bit about the forfeiture. He's forfeiting, it has to pay, in terms of a restitution, $107,550. And that was determined by the judge and the prosecution and the defense, in terms of that was sort of the money that Costa benefited in terms of his crimes. What normally happens with forfeiture, and how does that work? And I guess who gets that money?
Well, that money would go to, really, I guess it would go to the probation department or the U.S. Attorney's Office. Not quite sure of where that would go in this instance. I mean, it's not the typical thing you would see in a criminal case would be restitution, right? If there's a victim. So, for example, in the Jasiel Correia case, you have restitution that would have to go to the victims of those crimes that he was convicted of. This is a little bit different. A forfeiture goes to the government, whether it goes to the probation department or some branch of the U.S. Attorney's Office. I'm not sure exactly where it would go, but it doesn't go to any particular individual. And it's not that unusual in these cases, and in other cases as well. For example, in a drug case, when the police seize cash, the prosecution then moves for forfeiture, and that was part of the disposition of this case, the sentencing in this case, because as you recall, there was testimony that he took, for example, in one instance, 100,000 from one of the marijuana vendors and kept 30,000 for himself. And there was another circumstance where I believe he took a certain amount of money and then kept it all for himself. So he's going to have to repay that. And as part of the probation, there were some interesting terms. One of the terms was that you cannot open any new credit lines until the money's paid, the fine and the forfeiture.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. And in terms of the home confinement, again, Mr. Costa is going to be on probation. 15 months is going to be home confinement, and he's limited to only his work commitments, any medical appointments, and any religious services that he may wish to attend. Is that normal in these terms of home confinement for these types of crimes that some people, they're at home, they still need to make a living, so they're allowed to do some things, but very, very limited?
Yeah, that's not particularly unusual. There's also a curfew. I forget exactly the hours that the judge mentioned, and he's going to be monitored by the probation department. I believe he also will be required to wear some type of monitor, some type of device, so that the probation department can keep track of him. And keep in mind, probation is not as easy as maybe some people think. And what the judge had mentioned, I think, also was that this is an opportunity for Mr. Costa to either toe the line and change his ways, or not. And if he doesn't, then he would potentially go back to jail if he violates the terms of his probation.
Yeah. And again, you talk about the curfew. The curfew is from 6 a.m. To 8 p.m. So Mr. Costa is available to do his work in that time, go to appointments, and the like. So I guess the next question for me to you, Steve, is next steps. Two of the other co-conspirators in the case are up. Those who also pled guilty are up for their sentencing next month. David Hebert and Hildegard Camara. Mr. Camara did also testify on behalf of the prosecution in the Jasiel Correia trial. Mr. Hebert did not. We have not seen anything as of yet in terms of a recommendation, in terms of both the defense and the government coming up with a recommendation in terms of the sentences. But based on what you've seen here, could, let's say, Mr. Hildegard Camara get some sort of a similar sentence because he did help the prosecution and Mr. Hebert did not?
Well, he could, but on the other side, he may not. I mean, you got to keep in mind, I think, at the beginning of this, that in any kind of public corruption case, the prosecution is looking for example, video, wiretaps, and in this case, they didn't have that, so they needed an informant or cooperating witness. And each witness, when they're interviewed by the U.S. Attorney's Office early on, has an opportunity to cooperate, and they have to make that decision. So what I'm getting to, I guess, is that it looks like in this case, Tony Costa early on, or at least earlier than others, decided to cooperate, and he gets the benefit of that. So the question becomes, for example, on Mr. Camara, he came along and cooperated later. So I'm not sure that the prosecution is going to have the same recommendation of no jail time for him. I mean, it remains to be seen. It's always also important to think about other mitigating factors, like you mentioned, Mr. Costa having to take care of his mother or someone else that was ill or under some disability in the family. What are mitigating factors? That's one of them. Also, whether or not someone has a prior record, and whether they're remorseful. but also in this case, their level of cooperation. And as the judge mentioned, Judge Woodlock mentioned, he meaning the judge, also took into account the testimony that the person gave. I think he mentioned that he felt Mr. Costa's testimony was credible. His demeanor was good. I don't know if the same is going to be said about Mr. Camara.
Right. And of course, with Mr. Hebert, again, he had a plea deal, pled guilty. There was opportunity for him to testify. He did not. And we just saw, a few weeks ago with Genevieve Andrade, the former chief of staff, also pled guilty. She was at her sentencing. And Judge Woodlock threw out the entire plea, saying that he thought that the agreement of her not getting any time was unfair, and that sort of goes back to square one. So again, there's possibilities here, right? That for Mr. Hebert, depending on the recommendation, it may not suit Judge Woodlock very well, right?
Right. Well, it's kind of hard to know why he didn't testify. Was it just that he was willing to testify, but it turned out that they didn't need his testimony? Or was there some other reason? Was he ill? Or some other reason why his testimony would not have been necessary? So that's going to depend on Mr. Hebert. It'll depend on his level of cooperation, why he wasn't called as a witness. And then you mentioned Jen Andrade, and the issue that makes her case different is that she was a public official in a sense, even though she wasn't an elected public official. She was nonetheless chief of staff paid by the city of Fall River. So that takes her case out of, or just makes it a little different than these other individuals who have pleaded guilty. So in her instance, and we don't really know for sure, but it appears that she didn't cooperate, or maybe she wasn't even given an opportunity to cooperate. So in her case, you have a situation where she's a public official, and she had pleaded guilty to 6 different serious criminal charges, didn't testify, didn't cooperate. And I think that's what really the Judge Woodlock really focused on as to why he didn't accept the plea agreement between both that was presented to him from both the defense and the prosecution.
Yeah, and in terms of Ms. Andrade, of course, now her plea reverts back to her original not guilty plea. So a lot of things can happen. We've talked about this. They can either come up with another a plea agreement with her. Although one of the charges, the bribery charges, which former Mayor Correia was found not guilty on, that may be a little difficult for the prosecution to move forward with, or there could be Ms. Andrade can decide to go to trial. So, there's a lot that still needs to play out here. In your opinion, how long will this maybe take in terms of what we may hear next in terms of Ms. Andrade and what may happen there? Because I would think now Judge Woodlock would want to move this forward to continue, with all of his cases to continue to move forward.
Yeah, I would think you're right about that. These cases have been lingering a long time, not necessarily anyone's fault, whether prosecution or defense, but we had this COVID pandemic, which delayed everything. But these are old cases, and particularly in the federal court, cases don't linger that long. And I would think Judge Woodlock wants to get all these cases resolved, and particularly with regard to Jen Andrade, I would think that he wants to have a decision made. And as you mentioned, there's a number of different options. We're back to square one, so she can certainly go to trial on all those charges. And the fact that Jasiel Correia was found not guilty of that of the bribery charge doesn't mean it doesn't carry any weight in her case. The prosecution can still go forward with that, although I think they'd have a real difficult time proving that, or they both sides, prosecution and defense, can try to come up with another disposition to present to Judge Woodlock. For example, prosecution might dismiss one or two of the charges. It might involve brief incarceration, or as you mentioned as well, she can certainly go to trial. And from the prosecution standpoint, they've already kind of had they've already presented that case, so it's not going to be very difficult for them to try that case if that's the defendant's choice.
Yeah. Very interesting time. So we'll have to wait and see. Attorney Steven Sabra, as always, thank you for your time. We'll talk again soon. Take care.
Thank you, Keith.
All right. And thank you for joining us today here on FRC Media. Have a great day.